Before the house becomes warm, your body has to learn where the warmth is hiding. That is the first quiet truth of a medieval winter. Not one secret trick, not one clever invention, not one roaring fire that magically turns a dark cottage into something comfortable and modern. A family survives by following an entire winter system: the hearth in the middle of the room, the wool cloak pulled close around the shoulders, the straw bed kept as dry as possible, the pot of pottage warming near the fire, the fuel pile stacked and guarded, the low doorway opened only when it must be opened, and sometimes the animals kept close enough to remind everyone that warmth, food, labor, smell, and survival all belong to the same house. This story mostly follows ordinary households in medieval England, especially between the 13th and 15th centuries, while leaving room for the many differences between regions, classes, buildings, and families. Not every home was the same. Not every winter was the same. But the cold asked many of the same questions. Imagine waking before dawn in a small rural house during the deepest part of winter. The world outside is still dark. The air inside is not warm in the modern sense. It is merely less hostile than the air beyond the door. The packed earth floor holds the chill of the ground. The walls, perhaps timber-framed and filled with wattle and daub, slow the wind but do not erase it. The roof above may be thick with thatch, darkened by years of smoke, smelling faintly of straw, soot, damp weather, and old fires. The fire in the hearth has not vanished entirely, if the household is lucky. Under the gray ash, a few embers still remember the night. If those embers live, the morning begins with hope. If they are dead, the day begins with more work, colder fingers, and the slow business of making flame again. The first thing you notice is that warmth is not spread evenly. It never is. There is a warmer place near the hearth, a colder place near the door, a damp place near one wall, a safer place for bedding, a place where smoke gathers above, and a place where someone has put wet shoes too close to the fire because there was nowhere better. The family knows this map without needing to name it. A child knows where not to sit. An older person knows which corner makes the joints ache. Someone knows which crack in the door should be stuffed again. Someone knows whether the roof has begun to leak near the sleeping straw. This knowledge is not written down. It is learned in the body. Modern heating teaches us to think of winter as an outdoor problem. The cold is outside, warmth is inside. A wall separates the two. In a medieval house, the boundary is much less complete. Winter enters by degrees. It comes through the floor, through the door, through damp clothing, through unglazed openings, through fuel that refuses to catch, through an empty stomach, through a blanket too thin for a child who is growing. It is not only weather. It is condition. It is economy. It is architecture. It is labor. It is the reason someone saved the driest kindling for morning, the reason a cloak is not thrown aside even indoors, the reason the soup pot matters as much as the fire. The adult who rises first does not step into comfort. They step into responsibility. Feet meet the cold floor. A hand reaches for wool. The body bends over the hearth, searching through ash. This is a delicate little moment, but it can decide the mood of the morning. A surviving ember means the house can be coaxed awake. A dead hearth means more time in the cold and more effort before anyone eats. If the tinder is dry, if the kindling was stored well, if the breath is steady and the fingers still obey, flame returns. If not, the family may have to begin again from flint and steel or borrow fire from a neighbor, depending on the place, the time, and the household's luck. This is why medieval warmth was never invisible. Modern warmth often hides inside walls, pipes, wires, tanks, switches, bills, and machines. Medieval warmth was visible as flame, touchable as wool, edible as hot pottage, countable as sticks, smellable as smoke, and fragile as an ember under ash. It could be lost. It could be wasted. It could be stolen by a door left open too long. It could be ruined by damp fuel. It could be swallowed by a large cold hall or protected in a small crowded cottage. A household did not simply have heat. It made heat, moved toward heat, wrapped heat, ate heat, shared heat, and tried not to let heat disappear before morning. If there is a child nearby, the child may still be asleep under whatever covering the household can spare. Perhaps a wool blanket. Perhaps a cloak. Perhaps bedding that began as straw, hay, rushes, or a simple pallet. Perhaps something better, if the family is more prosperous. A child's warmth might depend partly on the body beside them. The modern idea of everyone tucked alone into separate heated bedrooms would have made little sense in many ordinary households. Privacy is easier when warmth is cheap. When warmth is precious, closeness becomes practical. Outside, the village has not yet begun to move. The path may be frozen hard or turned to cold mud. The yard waits. Animals need attention. Water may need fetching. Fuel must be brought closer. Food must be prepared. The first opening of the door lets in a blade of cold so sharp that the whole room seems to flinch. For a moment, the hearth, the bed, the clothing, and the bodies all feel less secure. Then the door closes, and the house returns to its small battle. So this is where the story begins, not with kings, not with battles, not with a grand castle covered in snow, but with a person kneeling at a hearth, looking for heat beneath ash. The winter is enormous. The fire is small. The house is imperfect. The family is tired. But if the ember lives, the day can begin. Chapter 2, they did not heat the whole house. The first modern misunderstanding is simple. We imagine the medieval family trying to heat a room. But for most ordinary people, the more accurate answer is that they were trying to heat life. They warmed the place where food cooked. They warmed hands before outdoor work. They warmed bedding enough to sleep. They warmed the body under layers of wool. They warmed a pot so that grain and vegetables became something more useful than cold storage. They warmed a child by pulling them closer. The house as a whole remained cold, smoky, drafty, and uneven. The family did not expect every corner to become comfortable. It expected each useful pocket of warmth to be protected. A modern heated room is a kind of invisible agreement. You walk in, and the air already serves you. The warmth is distributed by machines, delivered by fuel systems or electricity, measured by a thermostat, and maintained without your constant attention. If the room is 70 degrees, the chair is nearly 70 degrees, the bed is nearly 70 degrees, and the air near the wall is close enough to make no difference. Medieval warmth was not like that. It was local. It lived in circles and layers. The circle near the hearth. The layer inside clothing. The pocket under bedding. The steam above a bowl. The heat trapped by a curtain or a cloak. Move away from that circle, and winter returns. In an older open-hall house, a hearth might sit in or near the main living space, with smoke rising upward into the roof area rather than being carried neatly away by a modern chimney. Some medieval and later medieval houses were altered over time, with chimneys inserted, upper floors added, and spaces divided. But the important point for ordinary winter life is that many households had to live with a form of heat that was useful and troublesome at once. The hearth gave warmth, light, and cooked food. It also gave smoke, soot, ash, and danger. It did not warm evenly. It did not ask whether your back was cold while your face was hot. It burned what you could afford to feed it. This unevenness shaped behavior. A person entering from outside might stand near the fire and turn slowly, warming one side and then the other. Damp shoes might be placed nearby, but not too close. A cloak might be hung where warmth could reach it without sparks finding it. A child might be told to move away, then told to come closer, depending on whether the problem at that moment was flame or cold. The family's seating was not random. It was a small geography of need. The oldest, the youngest, the ill, the wet, the person cooking, the person mending, and the person who had just come in from the yard all had different claims on the warmest space. The house itself could not be sealed like a modern home. It had to breathe because smoke had to go somewhere. It had to function as a workspace, storage space, sleeping space, and sometimes animal-related space. It had doors that opened to daily labor. It had walls that could be patched but not perfected. It had a roof that protected against rain and snow but carried the memory of smoke. It had openings for light that also admitted cold. If you tried to close everything too tightly, smoke could become worse. If you opened too much, warmth fled. The household lives between those two problems. This is why clothing mattered indoors.
Modern people often take off coats once inside because inside is warm.
In a medieval winter house, inside was only less exposed.
Wool remained necessary. Hoods could remain useful. Cloaks became extra walls. Sleeves might be pulled down over cold hands. A belt tightened a garment close to the body. A person did not always dress for outside and then undress for inside. The house did not provide that luxury consistently enough. The same principle applied to sleep. A bed was not simply a place to rest. It was a heat-preserving device. Bedding, straw, wool, bodies, curtains in wealthier homes, and even the location of the bed all mattered. People did not need a theory of insulation to understand that a raised bed was better than a cold floor, that dry straw was better than damp straw, and that a shared cover held warmth better than a lonely one. The body understands before the mind explains. Food also belonged to this system. A hot bowl of pottage was warmth made edible. Bread was energy made portable. Ale, broth, grain, beans, peas, leeks, cabbage, onions, oats, barley, cheese, salted meat when available, all entered winter life not as menu items in a modern kitchen but as parts of survival. Food did not only fill the stomach. It helped the body produce heat. Hunger made cold worse. A thinning pot could change the temperature of a household without changing the weather. Fuel was the hidden governor of all this. A family might know exactly how to build a better fire and still lack the wood to do it. They might know the comfort of a brighter flame and choose a lower one because the night was long. They might save better fuel for cooking and accept a colder room. They might bank embers under ash because keeping a fire alive was easier than making a new one. They might gather twigs, brushwood, or small fuel with care because every bundle represented time and permission as much as material. So when we ask how medieval families survived winter without modern heating, the answer is not that they were tougher in some romantic way. They had skills, habits, and endurance, yes, but they also suffered when the system failed. The better answer is that they arranged life around small warmth. They did not demand comfort from the whole room. They demanded enough from the hearth, enough from the cloak, enough from the bed, enough from the pot, enough from stored fuel, and enough from one another. Winter remained inside the house. They simply made it smaller. Chapter 3 Walls of mud, timber, thatch, and drafts. A medieval house was not a failed version of a modern house. It was a practical answer to local materials, local weather, local skills, and local money. If you look at it only by what it lacked, insulation, glass windows, central heating, sealed flooring, modern chimneys, you miss what it was trying to do. It was trying to stand through rain and wind. It was trying to protect grain, tools, bedding, children, animals, fire, and sleep. It was trying to be reparable by people who could not order replacement parts from a warehouse. In winter, every part of that house became part of the family's survival system. The walls might be timber framed, with spaces filled by wattle and daub. The wattle was a woven lattice of sticks or split wood, the daub might include clay, earth, straw, dung, sand, lime, and other materials depending on place and practice. To modern ears, this can sound crude, but it was a flexible and long-used building method. It could be made from available materials. It could be repaired. It could harden into a useful barrier. It could keep out much of the wind. But it was not a perfect modern wall. It could crack. It could suffer from damp. It could need patching after weather and time had their way with it. In other regions, houses might use cob, stone, or other local forms. Where stone was common, stone could provide strength but also cold mass. Where timber was abundant, wood-shaped frames, roofs, doors, and internal divisions. Where thatch covered the roof, thick straw or reed could shed rain well when maintained properly, but it brought its own dangers and responsibilities. Thatch and fire were uneasy neighbors. A spark in the wrong place could turn warmth into disaster. The very roof that helped protect the household could also become part of the household's fear. Inside, the house may have had a packed earth floor. Such a floor is close to the ground in a way modern floors are not. It can be swept, hardened, covered in places, strewn with rushes or straw in some households, but it still carries damp and cold. Your feet feel the season.
A wooden stool, a bench, a board, a pallet, anything that separates the body from the ground gains importance.
A child sitting too long on the cold floor is not merely uncomfortable. The cold has found an easy road.
The doorway mattered almost as much as the hearth. A door is a simple object until winter makes it complicated. It has to open, because life cannot happen inside only.
People need water. Animals need care. Fuel must be brought in. Waste must go out. Work calls. Neighbors call. Church bells call.
But every opening of the door lets warmth escape and weather enter. Someone carrying sticks might shoulder the door open quickly, step in, drop the bundle near the wall, and close the door fast, because the room has lost enough already. In a cold house, manners include not wasting heat.
Openings for light created another trade.
A larger opening means more daylight, and daylight is valuable in a world where candles are not cheap for ordinary people.
But light can come with cold.
A smaller opening means darker work and less wind. Shutters, coverings, oiled cloth in some contexts, and other solutions could help, but nothing made an ordinary cottage feel like a modern sealed room. Winter turned architecture into compromise.
The roof space was also part of the heating story.
In houses with open hearths and no proper chimney, smoke rose into the upper space and slowly escaped. Over years, it could darken timbers and thatch. That blackening, unpleasant as it was for the people who lived with smoke, can become evidence for later historians and building experts. The house keeps a record of its fires.
A modern person sees soot and thinks of dirt.
A historian sees the path of heat, smoke, and domestic life. Wind had favorite places.
Every family knew them. A gap near a lower wall.
A door that did not sit perfectly. A roof edge where weather came in. A corner where bedding should not be placed.
A damp line after rain. These were not theoretical building defects.
They were daily facts. A household might stuff gaps, hang cloth, move bedding, repair daub, add thatch, block a draft, or simply avoid a place in the room when the wind came from a certain direction.
Survival was partly maintenance. A small house had one advantage: less space for heat to lose itself in.
A poor cottage could still be miserable if fuel and bedding were poor, but smallness could concentrate warmth.
A larger house, even a richer one, could be harder to heat.
A great hall with a large fire might look impressive, but heat rises, smoke rises, and cold stone or broad timber spaces can swallow comfort. This is one of the more interesting reversals in medieval winter. Wealth brought more resources, but size brought new problems.
The medieval house also changed through time. Some open halls were later modified. Chimneys were inserted. Floors were added. Rooms were divided. These changes were not just architectural trivia.
They altered how families lived with smoke and heat.
A chimney could make a room more usable.
A floor could create private or storage space.
A fireplace could focus heat differently. Comfort did not arrive all at once.
It entered slowly, unevenly, first for some households and later for others. If you stand in that winter house long enough, you begin to understand that every surface is doing work. The wall slows wind. The roof sheds weather. The floor reminds the body of the earth. The door controls loss. The hearth creates a center. The bedding stores a little warmth. The food pot turns fuel into strength.
Nothing is idle. Nothing is merely background.
The house is a winter machine, built from imperfect parts, repaired by tired hands, and judged each morning by one question: did it hold enough warmth to let the family begin again? Chapter 4, The Hearth, the Smoke, and the Morning Ember. The hearth was the heart of the house, but it was not a romantic heart. It was smoky, dangerous, useful, dirty, comforting, and demanding. It was where food became edible, hands became less stiff, damp cloth slowly gave up moisture, and darkness gathered into a circle of light. It was also where sparks might escape, where smoke might sting the eyes, where ash had to be cleared, where children had to be watched, and where fuel vanished into the air.
In a medieval winter household, the hearth did not simply warm life. It ruled life.
A central hearth in an open hall behaved very differently from a modern fireplace.
There might be no neat chimney carrying smoke away. Smoke could rise into the roof space, searching for vents, louvres, gaps, or any path the building allowed.
In still weather, smoke might linger.
With damp fuel, it might thicken.
With a poor draft, it might sink lower and irritate everyone. Yet the family could not simply abandon the fire because the fire was cooking, heating, lighting, and protecting. Smoke was not a separate problem from warmth. It was the price warmth often charged.
The morning ember was precious. Before dawn, someone might kneel and move the ash gently aside.
Not all ash was dead. Under the surface, the previous night's fire might have left a dull red coal, weak but alive. If the household had banked the fire well, covering embers with ash to slow their burning, the ember could be coaxed back. A little tinder. A breath. A dry splinter. Patience. The first thread of smoke. Then a glow. Then a small flame taking hold. This was not dramatic in the way battles are dramatic, but for the household it mattered more than a distant battle ever could.
If the ember was gone, mourning became harder. Fire making with flint and steel required dry tinder and skill. Damp conditions made everything more difficult. A family might need to borrow fire from a neighbor if that was possible. The social life of fire is easy to overlook. A village was not only a collection of houses. It was a network of small dependencies. Fire, tools, labor, news, food, and help moved between households in ways that could be ordinary or tense, generous or obligated. The hearth also controlled cooking. A pot hung over the fire or stood near it. The heat had to be managed carefully. Too fierce and the food burned or fuel was wasted. Too weak and the grain stayed hard, the beans stayed stubborn, the water did not properly heat, the household waited. Cooking was not an isolated kitchen activity separated from living space. It filled the room with steam and smell. It warmed the hands of the person stirring. It gave everyone a reason to watch the same center. Drying was another task. Wet wool, damp shoes, cloth, gloves, wraps, and tools might all need the hearth. But the hearth was crowded. Put something too close and it could scorch, shrink, stiffen, smoke, or catch. Put it too far away and it would still be damp by morning. A pair of wet shoes near the fire might become a small household argument without anyone writing it down. A cloak needed for outdoor work cannot remain wet forever. A child's garment cannot be sacrificed to smoke and sparks. Heat had to be distributed like money. The hearth produced ash, and ash itself had uses. It could be part of cleaning, lye-making, gardening practices, and other household tasks depending on place and circumstance. Nothing in a poor household was simply waste if it could serve. But ash also made dust. It settled, moved, entered cracks, clung to hands. A person who lived beside a hearth carried traces of the hearth everywhere. Fire risk never disappeared. A thatched roof, wooden beams, dry straw, hanging cloth, sparks, sleepy people, and animals nearby could create danger. Medieval communities understood fire as a serious threat. Towns, in particular, feared it because buildings stood close together and one household's accident could become a street's disaster. In a rural cottage, fire could destroy a family's shelter, stored food, tools, bedding, and future in one night. Warmth and destruction were separated by attention. Children learned the hearth early. They learned that flame was beautiful and not to be trusted. They learned that a cooking pot could burn. They learned that sparks jumped. They learned that smoke meant moving or waiting, depending on what adults said. They might be given small jobs, bringing a stick, watching a younger child, holding a bowl, staying out of the way. In winter, the hearth was a school. At night, the hearth changed the room's mood. A bright fire allowed work, mending, stirring, sharpening, sorting, talking. A low fire signaled slowing down. Embers made faces softer and corners darker. Smoke rose into the roof, and the family's world shrank to what the fire allowed them to see. Beyond the hearth, the house was shadow. Beyond the door, winter waited. The fire was not enough to make life comfortable, but it was enough to gather life into one place. That is why the hearth appears again and again in this story. It was the center, but not because it solved winter. It was the center because everything else depended on it: food, drying, light, warmth, morning, evening, memory.
A medieval winter house without a living hearth was not just colder.
It was less organized. The day had lost its starting point.
Hashtag chapter 5, fuel was wealth before it was fire. Every flame in the hearth began somewhere else.
Before it warmed the room, it was a branch in a wood, a stick in a hedge, a piece of peat cut from wet ground, a bundle of brushwood carried home, a log split by hand, a right granted by custom, a purchase in town, a chore assigned to a child, or a burden on someone's back. Fuel was not merely material. It was time, law, labor, weather, ownership, and luck.
A family that had fuel had more than fire.
It had options. Woodland in medieval England was not an open free store for everyone.
Rights to take fuel could be shaped by custom, lordship, common rights, forest law, and local practice.
Some households might have rights to collect deadwood or smallwood for their own use.
Others might buy fuel, gather what they were allowed, or depend on arrangements tied to tenancy and labor.
The details varied, but the pressure did not.
Winter made access to fuel one of the most important facts in a family's life. This is why a pile of sticks near the wall is not a humble background object.
It is a visible measure of survival. Each bundle represents a trip outdoors. Someone had to bend, gather, cut, bind, carry, dry, and store. Children might be sent to collect smaller pieces. Adults might carry heavier wood. An older person might sort the driest kindling for morning.
A family might know exactly which fuel should be saved for cooking and which could be used for brief warmth.
The fire in the hearth is the final moment of a long chain of work. Dryness mattered almost as much as quantity. Damp fuel smokes, resists flame, and wastes effort.
A family might have wood and still suffer if the wood was green or wet. Storing fuel under cover, stacking it where air could reach it, keeping kindling protected, and saving the driest pieces for the coldest or earliest hours were not minor domestic details. They were winter strategy. A person who can start a fire quickly on a freezing morning has inherited more than a trick. They have inherited a system of preparation. Fuel also had to be rationed.
This is difficult for modern imagination because modern heating is usually continuous. Medieval heat could not always be.
A family might keep a fire low during parts of the day, feed it more strongly for cooking, then bank it at night. They might decide not to warm the house more because tomorrow would be colder, or because the fuel pile looked too small, or because the food needed cooking later. Comfort was weighed against future need.
In some regions, peat or turf could play an important role. Peat had to be cut, dried, transported, and stored.
It could provide valuable fuel where wood was scarce or expensive.
But like wood, it represented earlier labor.
The warmth of a winter evening might have been dug months before from wet ground. Other fuels, such as brush, gorse, bracken, straw, or even dried animal dung in some places and periods, remind us that people used what landscapes gave them. There was no universal medieval fuel story. There were local fuel worlds.
Urban families had different problems.
In a town, fuel was more likely to be bought, delivered, stored in smaller spaces, and affected by price.
A cold winter could make fuel expensive.
A poor urban household might feel cold not because the woods were empty, but because the market was unforgiving. Fire risk in crowded towns also made fuel and flame more dangerous.
Heat in the city was a public concern as well as a private need. Fuel connected directly to food. A pot of peas or beans needs time. Grain needs cooking. Bread needs baking.
Water may need heating.
A family short on fuel might not simply feel colder, it might cook differently.
Foods that simmered near a steady fire made sense.
Meals that demanded constant high heat did not.
The winter menu was partly written by the fuel supply. Imagine a child carrying a small bundle of sticks in from the yard, proud because the bundle is useful, annoyed because the fingers ache, and careful because dropping sticks into mud would make the adult sigh. Imagine an older woman sorting pieces by size: tinder, kindling, small sticks, larger fuel.
Imagine someone looking at the pile and mentally counting nights.
The cold outside is one kind of winter. The shrinking fuel pile is another.
Fuel also influenced sleep. A family with enough fuel might keep a stronger evening fire, dry bedding better, and revive the hearth more easily in the morning.
A family with too little might go to bed earlier, sleep colder, eat thinner food, and wake to a dead hearth.
The difference between those two families might not be visible from the outside of the house. Inside, it would be felt in every hour. The most haunting thing about fuel is that it disappears while saving you.
A log burns and becomes warmth, light, smoke, and ash.
It performs its service by ceasing to exist. Each evening, the family watches stored labor vanish into useful flame.
There is comfort in that, but also calculation. A cheerful fire is not innocent when the winter is long.
The household must ask, again and again, how much warmth tonight can be spared from tomorrow.
Chapter 6 Clothing was the first heating system. Before the room could warm you, your clothing had to try.
In a medieval winter, the most reliable warmth was the warmth you wore.
Linen close to the skin were available, wool over it, a tunic, gown, kirtle, hose, hood, cloak, cap, shoes, mittens or wrapped hands depending on need and means. These were not just garments. They were a personal shelter. They were walls that moved. They were the first defense against a house that could not be made fully warm.
Wool mattered because it could hold warmth even in a damp climate better than many alternatives. Medieval England was a wool country in more ways than one.
Sheep, wool production, cloth making, trade, and clothing were tied deeply to the economy. But for the person standing in a cold house, the economic story becomes bodily. Wool on the shoulders is warmth. Wool over the head is relief. Wool around a child is a small fortress against the night. The value of cloth becomes obvious when the wind finds the place where cloth has worn thin. Linen might serve as an underlayer for those who had it, easier to wash than wool and more comfortable against the skin. But linen did not replace wool's winter importance. Layers worked together. The inner layer helped protect the outer garment from the body. The outer wool helped trap warmth. A belt could hold garments close and reduce drafts. A hood covered the head, neck, and sometimes shoulders. A cloak added a final barrier, especially outdoors, but it could be useful indoors too when the house remained cold. The hood deserves attention. Modern people sometimes think of hoods as style, but in a medieval winter, covering the head and neck was practical.
Cold finds the neck quickly. Wind enters at collars.
A hood could protect a person walking to the well, carrying fuel, tending animals, or sitting in a smoky house where the room was never fully warm.
Indoors, keeping the head covered was not necessarily odd. The house did not provide enough heat to make every layer unnecessary.
Shoes and hose mattered because the floor and ground took heat mercilessly. Medieval footwear varied by period, region, and wealth, but ordinary shoes were not waterproof modern boots.
Mud, ice, rain, and cold earth could make feet miserable.
Wet feet made a person colder everywhere. Drying shoes was therefore part of winter survival, not cosmetic neatness. Too close to the fire and leather might harden or suffer. Too far and it remained damp. A pair of shoes turned carefully near the hearth is one of those small scenes that tells the truth about pre-modern life.
Clothing also demanded labor before it could protect anyone.
Wool had to be shorn, cleaned, carded, spun, woven, fulled, cut, sewn, mended, passed down, patched, and protected. Linen came from flax, with its own chain of labor. Cloth was valuable because labor lived inside it.
A patched sleeve was not simply a sign of poverty.
It was evidence of sense. If the sleeve still warmed the arm, it remained part of the winter system. A garment could pass from one person to another, from adult to child, from best wear to workwear, from clothing to patch, from patch to rag, until almost nothing was wasted. For poorer households, the lack of enough clothing could be dangerous. One cloak for too many needs. Shoes that failed before winter ended. A child growing out of a garment before another could be made. A widow without enough cloth to replace what had worn thin. A laborer whose clothes were soaked during work and could not be dried quickly enough. These are not grand historical events, but they are the events by which ordinary winter was measured.
At night, clothing and bedding overlapped.
People might sleep in some clothing, especially in cold weather.
A cloak might become an extra blanket. A hood might remain near the head. Removing garments was not always desirable when the air itself bit.
Modern sleep often begins by taking off the day.
Medieval winter sleep might begin by keeping part of the day on. Clothing also shaped social status.
Better cloth, fur linings, finer shoes, brighter colors, and more garments signaled wealth.
But even elite clothing had practical winter value. Fur did warm. Heavy fabric did matter.
A rich person might feel cold in a large stone chamber, but they had more cloth between themselves and cold. A poor person's clothing carried less margin.
The difference between one layer and two could define a day. Think of a family gathered near the fire in evening. Not undressed, not lounging in indoor comfort, but layered. Hoods still on. Cloaks around shoulders. Sleeves pulled down. Smoke held in wool.
A child tucked under an adult's arm. Someone mending a tear because tomorrow the wind will look for that tear.
Someone turning a damp ham toward heat.
Someone shaking straw from a cloak that served as bedding the night before. This was not fashion. It was survival stitched into cloth. If the hearth was the heart of winter, clothing was the skin of survival. It did not remove cold from the house. It kept the cold from reaching too deeply into the person. And in a world where the room would not always protect you, that made clothing one of the most important technologies a family owned. Chapter 7, the bed had to be dry before it was soft. A medieval winter bed did not have to be luxurious to matter. It had to separate the body from the cold ground, hold warmth through the night, stay as dry as possible, and help people wake with enough strength to work. Softness was welcome, of course. No one in the past disliked comfort simply because they lived before us. But for many ordinary families, the first question was not, is this bed soft? It was, will this bed keep the cold from taking too much? Sleeping arrangements varied widely. Wealthier households might have wooden bedsteads, mattresses stuffed with wool, feathers, straw, or other materials, linen sheets, wool blankets, bolsters, and curtains that helped create a warmer pocket. Poorer families might rely on pallets, straw, rushes, hay, simple mattresses, cloaks, and shared coverings. Some people slept on raised beds. Some slept closer to the ground. Servants in larger households might sleep in shared spaces. Children might share beds or bedding. There is no single medieval bed. There are many beds, each revealing the resources of the household. Dryness was crucial. Dry straw traps air. Dry wool warms. Dry bedding can hold the body's heat. Damp bedding does the opposite. It steals. It chills slowly. It makes sleep shallow. It can turn an ordinary cold night into a dangerous one for the old, the sick, or the very young. A roof leak near bedding was not a small inconvenience. A damp pallet was not merely unpleasant. It meant the winter had entered the place where the body was most vulnerable. Bedding therefore required care. Straw or rushes might need changing when possible. Cloth needed airing. Blankets needed drying if they had taken damp. A cloak used outdoors and then as bedding carried weather back into sleep unless dried properly. In a small smoky house with limited fuel, drying everything was difficult. The family might choose which garment or blanket needed the fire most. A child's wet wrap, a laborer's shoes, an older person's blanket, a cooking cloth, a cloak needed at dawn, all competed quietly for the same heat. Shared warmth was practical. A child sleeping alone loses heat differently from a child sleeping beside a sibling or parent. Multiple bodies under a cover make a warmer pocket. Modern privacy makes this feel strange, but winter has never cared much about privacy. In many ordinary households, closeness was not simply affection. It was efficiency. The family bed, shared bedding, or crowded sleeping area could be uncomfortable, noisy, and lacking privacy, but it preserved warmth. The location of sleep mattered too. Near the hearth might be warmer, but smoke, sparks, movement, and household activity made it imperfect. Against a wall might be colder or damper. Near the door might be miserable. Raised bedding, where available, helped avoid the coldest floor air and ground damp. Curtains around beds in wealthier homes helped block drafts and trap body heat. In poorer homes, the same principle might be attempted with simpler means: a cloak hung, a bed placed away from the worst draft, bodies arranged carefully.
Imagine waking in the night. The fire has sunk low. The house is nearly dark.
The warm place under the blanket is real, but fragile. If you turn too much, cold enters.
If the cover slips, the air touches your neck.
If you need to rise, the decision is unpleasant. The floor waits. The cloak is nearby but cold on the outside.
Someone beside you breathes slowly. Somewhere above, the roof creaks.
Somewhere near the hearth, ash settles. This is one of the quietest forms of winter discipline, staying still because movement costs warmth. For the elderly, bedding could be a matter of mercy.
Age makes cold harder. Stiffness, illness, and weakness turn small discomforts into larger threats.
A family might place an older person where drafts were fewer, give them an extra covering if one existed, or keep them nearer the hearth.
But poverty limits kindness. Love cannot create blankets that are not there.
Many medieval households cared with the materials they had, and sometimes those materials were not enough. For children, winter beds were schools of endurance. They learned how to curl into warmth, how not to kick away the covering, how to stay close, how to wait for morning, how to recognize the sound of an adult rising to the hearth. They learned that the best part of the night was not softness but the small warmth that had gathered under cloth and body. A child might dread the moment when an adult lifted the cover and cold morning air entered.
Childhood in winter included many tiny shocks like that. Bedding also represented stored labor. Straw had to be cut or obtained.
Wool had to be produced.
Cloth had to be made.
Wood for a bedstead had to be shaped. Even a humble sleeping place contained the work of fields, animals, hands, and seasons. A bed was an object, but also a record of the household's ability to prepare. By morning, the bed tells the story of the night. The center may still be warm.
The edges may be cold. Straw may be flattened. A blanket may smell of smoke.
A cloak may have slipped. A child may have moved closer in the dark.
If everyone rises, stiff but alive, the bed has done its work.
It did not give modern comfort. It gave shelter to the body while the fire slept. ## Chapter 8, The Winter Pot and the Heat You Could Eat. In winter, food was another form of fire. A hot bowl placed in cold hands changed the body from the inside.
It did not warm the room evenly.
It did not stop the wind. It did not fix the roof or fill the fuel pile. But it gave strength where blankets could not.
For a medieval family, the pot near the hearth was not just cookware.
It was a second center of warmth, a place where grain, water, vegetables, legumes, scraps, salt, thyme, and fuel became survival. Pottage is one of the most useful words in this winter story because it was flexible. It could be thick or thin, plain or nourishing, ordinary or desperate. It might include oats, barley, peas, beans, leeks, onions, cabbage, herbs, and whatever else the household had and the season allowed. In a better moment, there might be cheese, a bit of bacon, salted meat, fat, or stock.
In a worse moment, there might be more water and less of everything else.
The name of the food might remain the same while the comfort inside it changed dramatically.
Bread was just as important.
Bread carried grain in a form that could fill the stomach and accompany nearly everything. Coarser bread for ordinary people, finer bread for the wealthy, mixed grains depending on supply, local practice, and status.
Bread could thicken a meal, soak in broth, stretch a pot, or travel with a worker.
A piece of bread near a hot bowl is not a feast, but in winter it can feel like security.
Ale also belonged to daily life in many medieval communities.
It offered calories, habit, and a common drink, though its strength varied. Brewing itself required grain, water, fuel, vessels, time, and knowledge.
Like everything else, it was not effortless.
The winter drink in a cup had a history before it reached the hand.
Food stores were decided long before the coldest night.
Harvest mattered.
Milling mattered. Preservation mattered. Autumn slaughter mattered.
Cheesemaking, salting, drying, smoking, storage, rent, tithe, and household management all shaped winter meals. A family might seem to face hunger in February, but the story may have begun in a wet harvest months earlier, a failed crop, a sick animal, a debt, or a store of grain damaged by damp. Winter reveals the success or failure of earlier seasons. This is why the late winter could be especially frightening. Early winter might still have stores. The pot might be thick. The family might feel confident. Deep winter tests fuel and food together. Late winter asks what remains. The pottage may become thinner. The bread may be watched more carefully. The best food may be saved for someone who was ill, pregnant, very young, very old, or working hardest. Hunger rarely announces itself all at once. Sometimes it enters by dilution. The cooking process itself was tied to warmth. A pot that simmered for hours used fuel, but it also made tough ingredients edible and warmed the room around the hearth. Peas and beans need time. Grains soften slowly. Vegetables release their strength into water. The household could let food cook while other tasks continued, but the fire had to be maintained. Too little fuel and the meal stayed stubborn. Too much flame and fuel disappeared before evening. The cook, often a woman in ordinary domestic contexts though household labor varied, managed not only flavor but survival economics. Smell mattered. In a smoky winter house, the smell of pottage could be reassuring. Leeks, onions, grain, smoke, fat if there was any, steam rising from a wooden bowl, the sour-sweet smell of ale, the dense comfort of bread. Modern people sometimes underestimate the emotional power of simple hot food. When the room is cold and the light is poor, a warm bowl becomes more than nutrition. It becomes proof that the household is still functioning. Children watched the pot closely. They learned whether the meal was generous or thin. They learned when to ask and when not to ask. They learned that scraping the pot was not just impatience. They learned that a crust of bread could be saved, that a bowl should not be wasted, that spilling food in winter was more than mess. Food discipline was part of household discipline. Class differences appeared clearly at mealtime. A wealthy household might have multiple dishes, better bread, more meat, spices, wine, servants, and separate cooking spaces. A prosperous rural household might have more dairy, more stored grain, better access to meat, and a safer margin. A poorer family might rely on pottage and bread day after day, with occasional additions when luck allowed. But even the rich depended on season, transport, storage, and fuel. Winter changed every table, though not equally. The food pot also connected humans to animals. Livestock needed fodder. Pigs might consume scraps. A cow's milk, if available, could matter greatly. Chickens could provide eggs, though laying patterns changed with season and conditions. Meat was not simply a daily abundance for ordinary families, it was tied to preservation, status, season, and household economy. An animal kept alive through winter represented future food or labor, but it also consumed resources now. Thus, even the contents of the human pot were connected to the animal's manger. When evening came and the family gathered, the pot gave rhythm. Stir. Serve. Eat slowly. Stretch. Save. Reheat. Thin if needed. Add if possible. A wooden spoon scraping the side of a pot tells a quieter history than a royal banquet, but not a smaller one. The medieval winter was lived one bowl at a time. To eat hot food in that house was to borrow warmth from the hearth and carry it inside the body. For a while, fingers loosened. Breath steadied. Children quieted. The old felt a little less cold. The work of tomorrow became possible. The pot did not conquer winter. It gave the family another hour, another night, another morning. ## Chapter 9, Animals Close to the House. In some medieval rural homes, animals stood closer to human life than most modern people would want. Not in every house, not in every region, and not always in the same room, but often near enough that their sounds, smells, warmth, needs, and values shaped the winter household. In certain longhouse or byrehouse arrangements, people and livestock could occupy different areas under the same roof or within the same connected structure, sometimes divided by a passage or partition. To modern imagination, this may seem unpleasant. To a medieval family, it could be practical.
A cow in winter was not just an animal.
It was food, wealth, future, risk, labor, manure, milk if conditions allowed, and social standing. A sheep was not just woolly scenery.
It could mean wool, meat, manure, value, and future lambs.
Pigs, chickens, geese, and other animals connected the household to food, waste, work, and economy. Keeping animals alive through winter could be nearly as important as keeping people comfortable because spring depended on what survived. Housing animals close had advantages. It protected them from weather, theft, and predators. It made feeding and checking easier in darkness or bad weather.
Large animals gave off body heat, though it is important not to turn this into a cozy fantasy.
Animal warmth came with moisture, dung, smell, insects, noise, and disease risk. A byre could make a building feel less empty and perhaps less bitterly cold in places, but it also made the house less clean by modern standards.
Medieval survival often meant accepting one discomfort to prevent a worse one. Imagine the winter night with animals nearby.
You hear shifting hooves, breath, a low sound from the dark, straw moving, a wooden partition creaking. The smell of smoke mixes with hay, dung, damp wool, leather, and earth. A child half wakes and knows, without thinking, that the animal is still alive.
That matters. The family's future is breathing in the dark. Animals demanded winter labor.
They had to be fed when grazing was poor or impossible.
Hay had to be cut and dried months before.
Fodder had to be stored, protected from damp, and rationed.
Water had to be provided, sometimes through ice or cold that made every task harder.
A person might have to leave the warmer part of the house at night or before dawn to check a sick animal.
Livestock do not pause their needs because humans are cold.
The decision to keep or slaughter animals before winter could be difficult. Feeding an animal through months of cold required resources. Some animals might be slaughtered in autumn, when meat could be preserved and fodder saved for more valuable stock. Others had to be kept alive because they represented milk, breeding, labor, wool, or future survival. Thus, the winter household was full of calculations.
Every mouth mattered.
Every animal alive in January had been chosen, hoped for, or endured.
Manure had value too.
Modern people separate warmth, cleanliness, agriculture, and food into different categories.
Medieval households could not separate them so neatly.
Animal dung meant smell and work, but also fertility for fields.
Fertile fields meant grain. Grain meant bread and pottage.
Bread and pottage meant bodies able to endure cold. The unpleasant parts of the household economy often fed the necessary parts. Children learned from animals in winter. They might carry small amounts of feed, gather eggs, help hold a lamp, fetch straw, watch a gate, or simply stay out of the way. They learned which animals were gentle, which were dangerous, which sounds meant trouble, which smells meant cleaning, and which adult voice meant move quickly. A winter house with animals was a place of practical education. Animals also added emotional pressure. A sick cow could darken the entire household mood. A lost pig could mean future hunger. A sheep dying in winter could be more than the loss of one animal, it could mean less wool, less meat, less value, less margin. Medieval families did not need modern accounting to know that animals were a form of savings with legs. The trouble was that savings with legs could get sick, eat too much, escape, freeze, or die. Not every family had enough animals to create this world. Landless laborers in poorer households might have very little livestock or none at all. Wealthier peasants might have more. Manorial and monastic estates managed animals on a different scale. The presence or absence of livestock shaped winter sharply. A household with animals had more work and more smell, but also more possible security. A household without them had fewer animal burdens but fewer buffers. In winter, humans and animals shared vulnerability. Both needed shelter. Both needed food. Both depended on earlier labor. Both could suffer from damp and cold. The difference was that humans had to plan for all of them. A medieval family survived winter partly by keeping alive the creatures that would help them survive the next year. The byre, the stall, the yard, the hayloft, the dung heap, and the hearth were all connected. So when you picture the medieval winter house, do not imagine only people around a fire. Imagine the wider household, the cow shifting in the dark, the sheep needing fodder, the pig turning scraps into value, the chickens quiet in the cold, the child carrying straw, the adult counting hay, the smell of animals near the smell of smoke.
Winter survival was not purely human.
It was a shared struggle under one roof, beside one wall, or just across the frozen yard. Chapter 10, The Poor Cottage, The Farmer's House, and the Great Hall.
Medieval winter did not treat everyone the same.
A poor cottager, a prosperous farmer, a manor household, a town laborer, a monk, a servant, a noble, and a child all lived under the same sky, but not inside the same winter. Wealth could not remove cold entirely, but it could place more barriers between the body and the cold.
Poverty did not mean people lacked knowledge.
It meant they had fewer materials with which to use that knowledge. In a poor cottage, smallness could help and hurt. A small space was easier to gather around one hearth.
Fewer corners meant fewer places where heat could disappear.
The family knew the house intimately, the draught, the damp, the spot where straw stayed driest, the place where the wall needed repair. But poverty made every weakness heavier.
Less fuel. Thinner bedding. Worse shoes. Fewer spare garments. A weaker door. Less stored food. If one thing failed, there might be no replacement.
A poorer household also had less flexibility. If clothing got wet, there might not be another set.
If fuel was low, there might not be money to buy more.
If an animal died, the loss could reshape the year. If a child grew and the old garment no longer fit, the household had to patch, alter, borrow, inherit, or endure.
Poverty in winter is often a problem of no second option.
A more prosperous rural household might have a better house, stronger timber, more rooms or divided spaces, more animals, better bedding, more stored grain, more fuel, and perhaps later improvements such as chimneys or fireplaces depending on period and place. Such a family still lived with cold, smoke, labor, and seasonal risk, but it had margins.
A margin is the difference between thinning the pot and not thinning it yet. Between drying shoes properly and wearing them damp. Between keeping the old person warm enough and merely hoping. The prosperous farmhouse may have been one of the more effective winter environments. Not as grand as a castle, not as poor as a cottage, it could balance size, resources, animals, fuel, and stored food. It could afford better repairs. It might have more hands to work. It might own or access more wool, blankets, and tools. Such households remind us that medieval peasant is not a single condition.
Rural society had levels, and winter revealed them. Then there is the Great Hall. It is easy to imagine noble life as warm simply because it is rich. But large buildings are hard to heat. A great hall might have a large central fire or fireplaces, servants to tend them, rushes or flooring underfoot, hangings, benches, tables, and plenty of people. Yet heat rises. Drafts move. Stone holds cold. High roofs swallow warmth. A lord near the fire may be comfortable while a servant near a doorway is not. Wealth gathers heat, but hierarchy decides who stands closest to it. Textiles were a form of elite warmth. Wall hangings, bed curtains, cushions, thicker mattresses, fur-lined garments, and better blankets all soften cold. A curtained bed in a wealthier chamber could create a pocket of warmer air. Heavy fabric on walls could reduce drafts. Fine clothing was not only display. It was insulation with status woven into it. A noble person might still complain of cold, and honestly so, but they complained through layers of advantage. Servants lived another winter inside elite households. They might benefit from the resources of the great house, food, shelter, fires, routine. But they also worked in cold passages, kitchens, yards, stables, dairies, brewhouses, and storage spaces. They rose early and slept in less private or less comfortable areas. The warmth of aristocratic life was produced by other people's labor. Someone carried fuel. Someone tended fires. Someone cooked. Someone cleaned ash. Someone fetched water. Someone cared for horses. The great hall glowed because hands kept feeding it. Monasteries and convents had their own patterns. Religious houses could be organized, communal, and better resourced than many poor households, but they were not modern comfortable institutions.
Warmth might be concentrated in certain rooms.
The kitchen, infirmary, warming room in some settings, dormitory arrangements, refectory, and church all carried different thermal experiences.
Religious discipline did not prevent cold fingers. Prayer did not insulate stone. Monastic winter combined order with hardship. Town dwellers faced another kind of winter.
In towns, houses could be crowded, fuel had to be purchased or brought through markets, and fire risk was severe. A town family might live above or behind a workshop, near neighbors, smoke, noise, and trade.
Access to rural gathering rights might be limited.
Cash mattered. If fuel prices rose, the poor felt it quickly. Urban winter could be less about fields and more about money, supply, crowding, and danger from fire in dense streets. Gender and age also shaped winter. Women in many households carried heavy responsibility for cooking, clothing, bedding, brewing, childcare, dairy work, and household management, though exact labor divisions varied. Men might cut and carry heavier fuel, work fields, tend animals, or perform wage labor, but women's winter labor often determined whether warmth was preserved inside.
Children helped according to age and ability. The elderly carried memory, skill, and vulnerability. A winter household was not one experience but many bodies under one roof. The interesting thing is that no class escaped the basic medieval problem: warmth was work. The poor worked with too little. The prosperous worked with more. The rich commanded others to work. But the fire still needed fuel. Bedding still needed dryness. Food still needed cooking. Animals still needed care. Winter entered every door, though it did not enter equally.
Walk in imagination from the poorest cottage to the manor hall on a snowy evening. You will see different bowls, different fires, different bedding, different smells, different clothing, different levels of fear. But you will see one gesture repeated in every place: someone moving closer to heat. Chapter 11. The real enemy was the combination.
Cold alone is hard. Cold with damp is harder. Cold with damp and hunger is dangerous.
Cold with damp, hunger, smoke, illness, darkness, and a shrinking fuel pile is the true medieval winter enemy.
No single discomfort tells the whole story.
The danger was the combination, the way small problems leaned on one another until the household had less and less room to maneuver.
Damp may have been one of the most persistent enemies. Damp walls, damp straw, damp shoes, damp hems, damp fuel, damp air.
Rain could be worse than snow in some ways because it soaked everything and then let cold finish the work.
A person who comes indoors wet cannot simply press a button and tumble clothing dry.
The hearth must do the job, but the hearth is already cooking, warming, lighting, and preserving embers. Drying takes space, time, fuel, and attention. A wet cloak may hang near the fire for hours and still feel unpleasant by morning.
Smoke was another enemy that could not be separated from the friend.
The same fire that warmed the house made the air worse. Smoke could sting eyes, irritate lungs, blacken timbers, cling to clothing, and settle into bedding.
The family could manage it but not always defeat it. Dry fuel helped. Draft helped. Building design helped. Chimneys helped when present. But for many households, smoke was part of winter's indoor weather. Hunger changed the body's ability to resist cold.
A person who has eaten well can endure cold better than a person living on thin food.
The body needs fuel just as the hearth does.
When meals shrink, cold grows.
This is why late winter could feel so different from early winter. In early winter, stores may still seem reassuring.
By late winter, grain is lower, fodder is watched, animals are thinner, and every meal is measured against the weeks still to come.
The weather might be the same, but the household is not. Illness made everything more fragile. A cough in a smoky house.
A fever under thin bedding.
A child too weak to stay warm. An old person whose hands cannot stop shaking.
A mother recovering from childbirth. A laborer injured and unable to gather fuel. Medieval households had remedies, knowledge, herbs, prayers, care, and practitioners of different kinds, but they did not have modern medicine. Warmth, food, rest, and nursing mattered enormously. Winter made caregiving harder because the caregiver was cold too.
Darkness added pressure. Winter days are short. Artificial light costs resources. Work that needs daylight must fit into a smaller window. Travel after dark becomes more difficult.
Feeding animals, fetching water, carrying fuel, and walking uneven paths all become riskier. Inside, the hearth gives light, but not enough to erase shadows. A household may go to bed earlier not because everyone is sleepy, but because staying awake costs fire and light. Stillness had its own danger. A body at rest cools. Sleep is necessary, but winter sleep requires enough covering and food to make stillness safe.
An elderly person sitting too long away from the fire might stiffen.
A child asleep at the edge of bedding might chill. A person too tired to remove damp clothing properly might pay for it later.
Winter demanded both movement and conservation. Move enough to live. Rest enough to save strength. Warm enough to continue. Do not waste what cannot be replaced. Bad luck mattered. A roof leak in the wrong week.
A stack of fuel soaked by weather.
A cow sickening when fodder is already low.
A child's shoes failing before market day.
A pot cracking. A neighbor unable to help.
A path blocked. A storm arriving when the household had planned to gather more wood. Medieval life was full of small dependencies, and winter exposed them.
Community could help.
Neighbors might lend, share, advise, bring fire, help repair, exchange labor, or notice distress. Parish life, kinship, customary rights, charity, and obligation all mattered. But community could also judge, demand, exclude, and fail. A poor household might be surrounded by people and still lack enough food or fuel. Medieval village life was not lonely in the modern suburban sense, but neither was it automatically kind.
The family's mental world was shaped by repetition.
We should not invent private thoughts for people whose voices are not recorded, but daily actions reveal pressure.
Counting sticks. Checking grain. Listening to a child cough. Looking at the roof after rain. Feeling the pot grow thinner.
Saving the driest fuel.
Turning shoes toward fire again.
These gestures are a kind of historical evidence. They show a household living under constraint. The danger of writing about medieval winter is that we may make it either too cozy or too horrible. A cottage with firelight can look beautiful from far away. Smoke, damp, hunger, and cold make it less beautiful up close. But it was not a constant nightmare either.
People laughed.
They told stories. They celebrated feast days. They shared food when they could.
They watched children grow.
They found comfort in routine. They loved their animals and cursed them. They complained about weather, as humans always have.
Winter was not the absence of life. It was life under pressure.
The real enemy was never simply snow at the door. It was snow at the door when the shoes were wet, the fuel was low, the pottage was thin, the old person was coughing, the roof was leaking, and the fire had gone out before dawn.
Medieval families survived by preventing too many problems from arriving at once.
That is what all the small tasks were for.
Patch the wall. Dry the cloak. Save the ember. Feed the animal. Stir the pot. Move the child. Count the fuel.
Make the cold smaller before it becomes too large. ## Chapter 12, The Ember Under Gray Ash.
By morning, if the family has done enough, the house is not warm. It is survivable.
That is the distinction that modern comfort can make difficult to understand.
Survival did not mean waking refreshed in a clean heated room. It meant waking stiff but able. Hungry perhaps, but not empty. Cold, but not dangerously so.
Tired, but with a fire that could be revived, a pot that could be warmed, animals still alive, and daylight coming slowly through the winter air. The medieval winter household was built from repetition. Before winter, repair the roof if possible.
Gather fuel. Store grain. Preserve food. Prepare bedding. Watch the animals. Patch clothing.
During early winter, conserve.
During deep winter, endure. During late winter, stretch.
Stretch the grain, stretch the fuel, stretch the bedding, stretch patience, stretch hope. Then wait for the first signs that the season is weakening: longer light, softer ground, returning work, animals moving differently, fields becoming possible again.
Spring did not arrive as decoration. It arrived as relief.
What made survival possible was not one invention, but a network of ordinary things.
The hearth, imperfect and smoky. The cloak, patched and smoky too.
The straw bed, dry if luck and labor allowed. The wooden bowl. The fuel stack.
The pot hook. The low door. The hood. The stored peas. The cow in the byre. The neighbor's ember.
The child's shared blanket. The old person's place away from the draft. The little habits that no chronicler thought to praise because everyone knew them already. History often remembers winter when it becomes disaster: famine, failed harvest, siege, plague, frozen rivers, armies struggling through snow.
But most winter history was quieter.
It happened when nothing famous occurred. A family woke, worked, ate, mended, dried, fed, carried, slept, and repeated the cycle. The achievement was not that they transformed winter into comfort. The achievement was that they carried life through it. Modern heating has changed our expectations so deeply that ordinary medieval endurance can seem almost unbelievable. We expect the indoor world to protect us from the outdoor world.
When it fails, we notice immediately.
For medieval families, the indoor world was never fully separate. The house was a shield, not a sealed chamber. The fire was a tool, not a guarantee.
Clothing was a wall.
Bedding was a shelter.
Food was heat. Animals were wealth. Family was warmth.
Every part mattered because no part was enough alone.
There is no need to romanticize this. Cold is not noble. Hunger is not charming. Smoke in the eyes is not quaint.
A child shivering under thin covering is not picturesque. The past does not become better because it was harder. But the people in it deserve to be understood as skilled, observant, adaptive, and deeply practical. They did not merely suffer winter. They worked with what they had to survive it. If you stand at the doorway of that medieval house just after dawn, you can see the whole system in one quiet image. Outside, frost lies on the path. The village is still blue with early light. Inside, smoke stains the beams above.
A wool cloak hangs near the hearth.
A wooden bowl waits beside the pot. Straw bedding is disturbed where bodies kept each other warm. Somewhere close by, an animal shifts in the dark. Someone kneels at the hearth and moves the ash with practiced care. Under the gray ash, there is a small red ember.
It is not much. It is not comfort. It is not safety. It is not modern heat. But it is enough to begin. And for many medieval families, enough was the quiet bridge between winter and spring.